to PRI's podcast. I'm your host, Romina Ichon. In this episode, our guest is Tom Rogan, political journalist and host of the relaunched McLaughlin Group, the original political pundit roundtable discussion started by John McLaughlin. Tom was invited by John McLaughlin to become a panelist when he was still host of the show. After the passing of John McLaughlin, the show is revived with Tom Rogan as a new moderator. Tom is also a prolific writer. You'll find his commentaries in the Washington Examiner, National Review, Fox News, and other media outlets nationwide. In this podcast, Tim and I, PRI's Director of Communications, and I chatted with Tom on his views on North Korea, single-payer healthcare, academic freedom, and of course, his memories of the great John McLaughlin. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to PRI's podcast, Tom. We're so pleased to have you on the show and have the chance to talk about foreign policy, which is an area you write about in your column a lot. The North Korea threat is on all our minds here in the West Coast and certainly in Hawaii, given the reaction after the false alarm. You wrote an interesting column recently where you said that President Trump's maximum pressure campaign on North Korea is now dead. If pressuring our allies and those in the region to step up and do more is not working anymore, do you think a new attempt at diplomacy will work?
Well, good to be with you. I tend to think that there is not much chance, unless the United States is willing to significantly alter its expectations about any deal. I don't think there's much chance of the diplomacy working absent the reinstigation of the maximum pressure strategy. And I think the reason for that is that China here is the critical component. And if China doesn't sense the United States is willing to consistently, continually escalate, it will have very little incentive to try and put the kind of pressure onto North Korea, onto Kim Jong-un, that would be necessary to compel him to alter his opportunity and objectives.
So the other big foreign policy issue in the early months of 2018 is Iran. You wrote a column recently where you talk about the recent threats against the U.S. by the Ayatollah Khomeini in light of the recent pro-freedom protests and the U.S.'s support for them. Is this a sign of a regime on its last legs, or are these the real threats of a resilient power?
Well, I don't think it's a regime on its last legs, but I would say it is a regime that has a problem with its legs, that a growing structural problem, primarily the sense of disenfranchisement of its very significant youth bulge population. A significant majority of Iranians, up to about 60%, are under 30. So that poses a serious problem for the regime in the sense that those individuals want to be able to get more access to freedom, opportunity, travel, and the basic things we take for granted. And the nature of the regime is such that it cannot provide those avenues for opportunity because the nature of the regime is based on a theological approach to governance that has this sense of moral expectation about what is and what is not an affront to God. And freedom and opportunity are seen by the Khamenei, the senior leadership, at least in the secular sense, in the sense that a lot of these young people want as affronts to God. So they, as much as they would want to sort of provide greater economic opportunity, etc., there's a cap on what they can do without undercutting the very essence of and the raison d'etre of the regime. And I think that economic component has a secondary complexity in the sense that the real hardliners, even beyond Khamenei, we think about the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, have a lot of economic control inside the regime, controlling vast swathes of the economy. And that's important. And they won't give that up because, of course, that gives them the means to be able to control, to advance their own interests, both inside Iran, but across the broader Middle East and indeed across the world.
Well, turning to domestic politics, single payer is, of course, a big issue for PRI, just like our president, Sally Pipes, who experienced these problems of single payer in her native Canada. You experienced single payer growing up in the UK. You wrote a column recently where you talked about the latest report showing the problems of the National Health Service. Based on your view and experiences, should Americans see the problems of the NHS as a preview of things to come if Bernie Sanders gets his way? Or as others say, in America, it'll be different?
No, I think certainly as a preview, and I always qualify with socialized medicine. For one thing, socialized medical system in the UK does better than us is allowing high school students who have very high grades to go straight to medical school. I don't think it's a waste of money, I think, in our system that we make them go to do an undergraduate degree first. Same with law school, for example. So that would be, reducing those educational costs would obviously reduce some of the structural costs in the system. But beyond that, the simple problem is that where you have a single payer system, the decisions over resource allocation are made by government, by civil servants who might mean well, but at the same time have a limited pool of resources and a system of essentially of infinite wants. And so scarce resources, the central economic problem is that where do you allocate those resources? And over time, you get into a situation as we are in now, as we see now in the UK with aging population, where the whole framework of the system falls apart. But look, one of the things that, Americans need to, I think, grasp more fully is the fact that for those on Medicare, for those who have health insurance, their access to timely quality care and individually targeted treatment and access to individually targeted doctors is far greater and far better than it is in the UK. And for a long time in the UK, it was older patients who were given less preference in the system in terms of accessing care, that it would be children who would come first. But now, because there is such high demand, such overwhelming demand, and the system can't cope with it, everyone's access to quality care is changing across the range, from whether it be cancer treatments to the most basic care that you have a serious injury and you go to the emergency room and you want it to get fixed up. So yes, the system structurally is not conducive to moral human interests.
Well, Tom, you have a front row seat in Washington to all of the domestic and international controversies these days. I don't know whether we should envy you or be making the sign of the cross for you. Certainly, President Trump is dominating the conversation these days. He's achieved a significant legislative accomplishment with the passage of tax reform right before Christmas. But now Congress and the president are back to the traditional election year food fights like DACA and the debt ceiling and the government shutdown. So getting out your crystal ball, what one or two big policy items do you think Congress and the president can reach agreement on in this very politically charged year?
Well, I do think they will reach agreement on immigration. The question there is whether it is DACA for a wall or something much more broad, something that addresses immigration, at the national level in terms of, for example, whether we have people coming in, skills-based visa expansion, the measure of security on the border, or whether it's just a very basic thing, some money for the DACA continuation. But I do think something will happen there, primarily because whatever they say, both sides have a vested interest in getting something done. I think another area of potential would be infrastructure spending. The issue I think Trump will face there is not so much Democrats, but Republican fiscal hawks who, swallowed their pride a little bit on the tax reform legislation, but on infrastructure would be very concerned about getting an infrastructure deal that had some kind of cost neutrality. And that is going to be hard to do, I think, with Democrats. I think there is a sort of, and I think, quite frankly, with President Trump sees it as something that, that the money just has to be spent and those fiscal questions can be deferred. And so you might potentially see a showdown with Paul Ryan on that. But I would say those are the two sort of issues where, some kind of bipartisan compromise are probably more likely than other areas.
Tom, turning to academia, debunking the virtues of socialism has also been a theme in your writings lately. There's a very troubling trend on campus among fringe progressive groups and in some corners of government pushing a new socialist vision of America. Arlan Suzumi, who is director of our education center here at PRI, wrote in his book, The Corrupt Classroom, School Curriculum in California is now even downplaying the brutality of communism around the world and what they teach students. What can be done to combat this growing socialist movement in America?
Well, I think facts, articulation of things like the realities of healthcare. One of the things I always say when I specifically speak to younger people who I think are more predisposed to, believe some of this narrative of everyone can do well is Google things. Google cancer survival rates in Europe. Google waiting times at hospitals for treatment, for surgeries, for important surgeries. Google the tax rates that these social socialized systems require. I mean, the sales tax in the UK, which is one of the lower tax areas of Europe, the sales tax there is 20%. Social security tax is about 5%. The income taxes, if you earn over about $60,000, $65,000, you're paying 40% income tax. Your local taxes are about 2 or 3%. There are a whole range of other taxes, and that's one of the lower ones. And then you look at, okay, things that benefit people's lives, whether it be new medical devices, whether it be, the things of our social lives, iPhone, whether it be companies such as Google and Amazon, and then at the high-tech sphere in terms of, constructing engines and microcircuitry. Those things come from America for a reason, because our system is predicated on the morality of individuals making choices that benefit their lives, that we spend money on things that benefit us, and the reciprocal reward for those who develop those things is that they can become very wealthy and successful. That is a positive moral thing in the sense that it, provides material benefit to our lives. So it's about articulating that, again, showing, where are these developments coming from? Why does the United States still lead the way in this kind of academic, scientific, business orbit? But also talking about the more raw edges of a socialized system, talking about, for example, the vast youth unemployment rates compared to the United States, the lack of access to opportunity, talking about the relative cost of going out for a dinner, going out to the Olive Garden type place is much more expensive across Europe. That pursuit of happiness tangent, talking about the entrenchment of poverty in places like Stockwell or Peckham in London and Clichy-sous-Bois in Paris, and frankly across the board in European cities. And of course those issues exist in America, but the idea somehow that the left portrays, that Bernie Sanders portrays here, that everyone can be a beneficiary and no one a cost, is on its face ludicrous and immoral, I think, in terms of the lie at the heart of the ideology. And I think it's about articulating that in a way that speaks to specifics.
Tom, you've also written some very entertaining columns about the fight over free speech on college campuses. This is something that we've covered here on PRI's podcast. Our own Steve Hayward has a front row view to all of the campus craziness right now with his teaching assignment at UC Berkeley. Judith Butler giving a speech there saying that socially conservative viewpoints should be outlawed. Now you have a real dichotomy between what Barack Obama and Van Jones and other prominent liberals who've said that all viewpoints should be welcomed on campus, and contrasting that with those like Judith Butler and Yvette Falarca who want to shut down free speech, in some cases violently. How do you think this current fight over free speech on campus will ultimately be settled?
I think positively. And look, I have a lot of disagreements with President Obama on many issues, but I think he deserves a lot of credit for his stance on free speech on campus. I referenced in a recent piece his interview with Prince Harry, oddly enough. He spoke up, I think, in quite a strong way in defense of free speech on campus. But look, I'm more optimistic on this one because I think the tide is beginning to turn. I think actually the vast mainstream of American society do have this reflexive sense, the exceptionalism, because that's what it is. It is unique to the world of free speech. I think also, you have eloquent speakers such as Ben Shapiro, who, obviously out in California, who come onto campus being described as a hate mongerer. And then when the videos are produced, that other students, the vast majority, I think, who are not perhaps as engaged with these issues as we might be, look at it and say, well, he doesn't come across that extreme. He doesn't come across as a, and many other speakers, Emily Jashinsky, who I work with, does a lot in terms of the feminist angle, and it is sort of more persuasive. So, I think the people like Judith Butler, it's just about calling them on what they're actually saying and just reporting on what they're saying. Because as with all, not with all, but with the significant element of liberal philosophy, it comes down on narratives that are not terribly intellectually robust, to put it nicely. I don't think that the foundational, when you're talking about restricting speech for the defense of what they would describe as the right calling a pejorative other or whatever, that they get lost in their own narratives and I think can be quite clearly called out by people in a way that most Americans look at this and say, okay, this is ridiculous. But look, it requires energy, it requires activism in challenging a decision by a college board where they refuse access to a speaker. It requires pushing back against this narrative, well, the security costs are too high. All of this stuff requires our attention. We can't take it for granted. But I think that attention, though, is why the tide is beginning to be turned. So it's positive, but again, we can't take any progress for granted.
Let's shift to something all of us at PRI are big fans of, the McLaughlin Group. You formed a bond with the late John McLaughlin, which led to you becoming one of the panelists on the McLaughlin Group. Tell us about your experiences working with John McLaughlin and what you learned from him.
Well, I was sending out emails to comments at McLaughlin.com asking if I could come on. And eventually, thanks to one of McLaughlin's longtime producers, John Roberts, who recommended me to McLaughlin when he asked, I was given a shot there, and I quickly formed a bond with John. I think, as an American who grew up abroad, grew up in England, obviously, one of the things that's why John liked me and I liked working with him is that he reminded me of his background as a sort of Jesuit teacher, and his sort of eccentricity in some ways, reminded me of sort of dealing with some of my teachers at school and certain headmasters. So, for example, with John, he was quite demanding in terms of scripts. Sometimes I worked with him on the intros to each issue. I did this as well as being a panelist, which some people didn't realize. But if I screwed something up or there was something he didn't like or it wasn't good enough, I could sometimes get a profanity-laden call and very, angry. But I liked that because I knew it came from a position of, he was utterly dedicated to the quality of what he produced to his viewers, and he knew he was giving me an opportunity. And I thought it was very sort of American in a way. You've got a great opportunity here, rise and fall. But when I did a good job, he was like, well done, great work. And obviously he gave me the opportunity to sit on that panel, which frankly I didn't deserve in terms of, my relative age and experience. And so I really very much enjoyed working with him and built a very close personal relationship with him, just because I think there was a lot of fun and clarity. And for all the, profanity-laden calls, there was some surreal calls. I think on my phone somewhere, I have to upload it to YouTube at some point. McLaughlin left a message saying about how he'd been watching David Ignatius, a Washington Post correspondent or columnist on news, and how Ignatius's head moved in a particular way. And it was just this surreal conversation, or the surreal voice message, that spoke to his kind of unique sense of humor. And so anyway, it was obviously a huge opportunity for me, and one that, I obviously miss him, but I'm glad we're continuing with what he created.
Well, just to gush for a moment, the McLaughlin Group has been one of my favorite shows since I was a kid, not to age myself. And one of the things that I always like the most about the McLaughlin Group is that despite all of the yelling, it really shows that people with wildly different views can get together and have a lively but intelligent conversation about politics and policy without calling people names or coming to blows. What one or two things do you think today's more toxic talk radio, cable news, social media, and blogger world can learn from the McLaughlin Group about improving our political discourse?
Well, I think the first thing is that we've sort of come full circle in the sense that the show, when it set up in '82, really was shouting at each other in the way that you see on cable news a lot of the time. But now, as much as that is there is a baseline of mutual affection and respect between the panelists, and it allows for those sort of rambunctious arguments. I mean, this latest show over the weekend, we had Bill Press on, who was obviously, much further to the left than Pat Buchanan, and they were going at each other and sort of, really taking apart each other's ideologies. But the beauty of it was that they did it with a smile and a sort of, that they reveled in almost like a family, in the best possible sense, dinner party kind of disagreement. So that condition of mutual respect is one that I think is very, very special. It's also the business sense, right? I mean, I do understand that cable news, there is a catering to specific audiences. And yet I think if, we'll see what our ratings do now. Obviously, we're in a sort of testing stage just in the DC market and YouTube for a few weeks. But I think the benefit that we have is that we can attract viewers from across the political spectrum regularly who might complain a lot about different, panelists that they don't like, but actually do enjoy tuning in to listen to those panelists.
Finally, Tom, there's nothing that we love to do more in the shadow of California's wine country at PRI than talk about public policy while enjoying a great glass of wine. Please share with our listeners your recommendation for your favorite wine or other adult beverage.
Oh, that's a very good question. Well, I do. On the red side, I tend to like Tempranieros, although I've had some bad experiences recently by ordering online. I think you have to be sort of quite specific on that. On the white, I like a Chablis. I was very fortunate in the sense my mother is a big wine aficionado, and growing up we would go traveling around France with my father. Actually enjoyed that as well, but he was more in terms of the history, and so we got to try out some great wines. I would say my only limitation at the moment is that I'm not quite at the earning level where I can regularly get a bottle of that sort of $40 and $30 and above wine, where it really becomes sort of quite a lot more special than the generics. But you can still there's a great red that I enjoy, Casillero del Diablo. Yeah, I mean, beyond that, what do I like? I quite like Scotch and bourbon, watered down with some ice, which Churchill did before people criticized me. Those would be my picks there.
Thanks very much, Tom.
Sure, thank you.
Thanks again to our guest, Tom Rogan, and to Tim Anaya. Check your local listings to watch the McLaughlin Group on Sundays or online at mclaughlin.com. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's a number 1. Also, check out our blog Right by the Bay on our website at pacificresearch.org. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for another episode of PRI's podcast.